Upon further review,
in Acts chapter 9, we see Saul, a persecutor of the newly minted Christian religion, which was birthed at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, have an untimely supernatural meeting with Jesus. During this encounter, Saul was struck blind, given a new name, and converted to Christianity. He was then tasked with the mission of spreading the Christian gospel to both Jew and Gentile. However, upon further review and by exploring the historical context of Judaism and Christianity, we're going to unpack what really happened to Saul on the road to Damascus, what he was really converted to, and how he actually became known as Paul. To put Christianity and Judaism into perspective, we're actually going to discuss 3 different historical paradigms, which are no more than just particular worldviews or just models. It's just a way that governs the way we see things and the way we interpret things and events. The way a person interprets the relationship between Judaism and Christianity plays a huge role in how they interpret the events of the entire book of Acts. The first paradigm we'll look at is called the better faith paradigm. In the Strasbourg Cathedral, built somewhere around the 13th century, are 2 statues. One represents Christianity. That statue wears a crown, which represents royalty. It has a chalice for the Eucharist that's held up and cradled. It has a very strong staff that's actually a cross. And his posture is very straight and very confident and very authoritative. The other statue represents Judaism. Her eyes are down, and as a matter of fact, she's completely blindfolded. She holds the 10 Commandments down by her side in shame or almost submission. Her staff is completely broken. And her posture is very hunched over, very weary, very tired. The conclusion is that the Christian church is somehow better than the Jewish synagogues. But there's actually a lot of problems and even some dangers in this thinking. First of all, it denies Israel's spiritual inheritance as God's chosen people. It's in direct opposition from Romans chapters 9 through 11 and Ephesians chapter 3. This line of thinking became part of this German scholarship or theology in the early 20th century, and we all see where that led. It led to the slaughter of 6 million Jews. This has actually become the basis of modern replacement theology and really easy justification for anti-Semitism. The second paradigm or model that we're going to look at is the mother-daughter paradigm. And this one actually seems to be more in line with modern Christian scholarship and actually doesn't sound too far off from what we've actually observed historically. In this paradigm, the mother, which is Judaism, gave birth to the daughter, which is Christianity. And as the mother, Judaism gets very old. She becomes less and less relevant, while her daughter, Christianity, is growing up and becoming more relevant. Eventually, when the mother dies, the daughter takes over. And if Christianity was actually born at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, then the Old Testament is Jewish and the New Testament is Christian. Old Testament before New Testament. Therefore, Judaism predates Christianity, and Judaism was the religion that died out. Here are the problems with that. While it at least recognizes the historical Jewish roots of Christianity, it's still based on replacement theology. It still assumes that Christianity is the sole heir of Israel's covenant, leaving no room for Israel as the enduring people of God. It also allows for this dichotomy between Christian things and Jewish things, including Scripture. And perhaps the biggest problem with the paradigm is its assumption that Judaism actually came first. The third paradigm we're going to look at is called the sibling paradigm. And this paradigm, this model, is going to be our compass point. It's going to be our foundation as we unpack Acts chapter 9. The main premise in this paradigm is that the Old Testament is not Judaism. And the New Testament is not Christianity. Acts in the original language refers to believers as Christianoi, or little Christs. But that's not the same thing as Christianity as a religion, but as another Jewish sibling whose identities were as followers of Yeshua. The mother isn't Judaism, but something that's called the ancient faith of Israel. And she didn't have one child or one religion, Christianity, but they had many children and many different religions. And they were all siblings. Each sibling interpreted and practiced the ancient faith of Israel very differently, and they didn't all survive. They were all very different, but they still have beliefs that bind them together, such as Shabbat, which is Sabbath, circumcision, monotheism. And some of these siblings of the ancient faith of Israel were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Qumran community, the Zealots, the Iscariot, and even something in Egypt called the Elephantines. And of course, the Jesus followers. We have the same thing for the Christian faith. We just don't call them paradigms or siblings. We call them denominations. Catholicism, Baptist, Southern Baptist, American Baptist, Independent Baptist, Methodist, Reformed Methodist, Pentecostal, non-denominational, and probably hundreds more. And the ancient faith of Israel isn't about religion, it's about historical heritage. It's not the Old Testament because most of the aspects of faith in modern or rabbinical Judaism weren't even practiced in the first century. The ancient faith of Israel is not what we think of when we think of Judaism. Instead, it's just their way of life. It's their ancestral beliefs. It's their understanding of their common history. It's the way that they do things, their customs, which actually do include worship customs. It's just their general worldview that's shared by most descendants of Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. It actually allows for Christians and Jews to coexist as heirs of the ancient faith of Israel, and not in direct succession of one another. Historical modern Christianity is not Jesus' Judaism, and it isn't even a sibling of the ancient faith of Israel. If you recall, who was the focus of Saul's ministry? It was the Goyim, the non-Jewish Gentiles. However, every trip he took, where did he go first? He always went to the synagogues, but why? He went to the synagogues to speak to those already involved in the ancient faith. He wasn't trying to convert them to a different religion, but rather to join a different paradigm or a different sibling. Think about it, it was more like to follow a different rabbinical teaching, that of Yeshua, Israel's prophesied Messiah. In the 2nd century, Ignatius was actually the first to draw a distinction between what is Jewish and what is Christian. He said, to be a Christian, a believer or a follower of Christ, you cannot be a Jew. And this became more prevalent during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. In the 4th century, Constantine Christianized the Roman Empire, but he really didn't. What he did was he allowed these Christians to practice their faith without any kind of fear of persecution. But he also allowed every other faith to be practiced without persecution except for one. And that one was the very, very new and still not fully developed rabbinical or modern Judaism. Because Saul predates both of these incidences, he's not a historical Christian, and therefore he didn't teach historical Christianity because it didn't exist. And because Christianity as a religion didn't exist, Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 was not the birth of the church. But we're going to take a look at that in the next video. What Saul actually expounded on, or what he explained, was the Jesus follower sibling of the ancient faith of Israel. And what that allowed were those outsiders, those goyim, those Gentiles, who had absolutely no skin in the game whatsoever, who had absolutely no hope, to be able to come into the ancient faith of Israel family as one of the siblings called Jesus follower. Saul actually speaks about this in the 3rd chapter of his letter to the Ephesians. I mentioned before that one of the main issues arising from that mother-daughter paradigm was that it assumes, as most Christians do, that Judaism came first. But upon further review, let's take a look at the historical development very quickly of both religions. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the diaspora, the disbursement of the Jews out of Jerusalem, only 2 major siblings remained: Proto or pre-Rabbinic Judaism and Proto or pre-canonical Christianity. They both shared the same root. They both had the same mother, if you will, which was the ancient faith of Israel. Samaritans and Jewish followers of Jesus survived, but over time they lost their ability to really influence worldviews, and their voices just quit being heard. So which of the siblings was actually the first to undergo severe Roman persecution? It was the Jesus followers. It actually happened in 64 AD under Emperor Nero. If you were living in 1st century Roman Empire, who were Nero and the other ancient Roman emperors actually persecuting? Were they persecuting a new Christian religion or a sibling of the ancient faith of Israel called Jesus followers? Now you have to remember, Rome's main concern wasn't who worshipped who and how they did it. They didn't care. What their main concern was is this thing called Pax Romana. They just wanted the peace of Rome. You weren't allowed, to shake any trees or stir up any of the waters or beat the hornet's nest. You could worship however you wanted as long as peace reigned in the empire. But what group seemed to always stir the pot during the 1st century? It was the Jesus followers. Which actually brings us to our big question. Which actually did come first? Canonical Christianity or modern Judaism? The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they actually began to be written in about 90 AD, so about 20 years after the destruction of the temple. These were historical accounts. They weren't written for the purpose of religious writings, although they did become part of the canonical or modern Christianity that a lot of scholars refer to as historical Christianity. But the first major collection of Jewish oral laws and traditions that were written down was called the Mishnah, and it means to study by repetition. It was the first major work of modern Judaism. Its writing began in the 3rd century, 200 years after the Gospels. It took about 200 years to complete, so now we're into the 5th century. It was written because the Judean scholars were afraid. A lot of their traditions were actually oral traditions of the Pharisees, and they were afraid that as people went out, as they were dispersed literally all over the world and they had no temple, they were afraid that these oral traditions were going to be forgotten, so they wanted to write them down. So upon further review, we see Christianity wasn't birthed out of Judaism. But Judaism, as we know it today, was actually birthed out of the need to preserve their ancient faith of Israel, which was threatened when the sibling Christianity separated from the family. As various writings were being studied and debated for the development of canonical Christianity, and before the Mishnah ever began to be written in Jerusalem, there was a new revolt. It was called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It was actually the very last Jewish revolt, and it happened in 132 to 135. After that revolt, the Romans completely wiped Judea and Jerusalem clean off the map. They renamed it Syria Palestina. and Jerusalem was renamed Alina Capitolina. In 380 AD, the end of the 4th century, just as the Mishnah was being completed, Theodosius I actually declared that Catholicism was going to be the state religion of the Roman Empire, whose emperor was actually going to be the king or ruler of modern-day Germany. And what we really need to keep in mind, this was such a brief overview. And none of it happened very quickly. There was, is, and there always will be a very complicated relationship between these two surviving descendants of the ancient faith of Israel. What's important is that we understand that the 1st century ancient faith of Israel is not the same as modern Judaism. In 1st century Palestine, Israel, the Roman Empire, whatever you want to call it, Christianity as a canonized religion didn't exist. Jesus-following Jews were simply another sibling, another paradigm of the ancient faith of Israel. Upon further review, we see that Saul wasn't the first Christian. He didn't convert to Christianity, and so he couldn't be teaching a new Christianized religion. And as we'll explore more in the next video, Pentecost was not the birth of the church. I've heard folks argue that God changed Saul's name to Paul, because if you think about it, every time Jesus changed someone's name, it kind of moved them in a different direction. He renamed Simon Petros, Peter, because, as Jesus said, on this rock, Petros, I will build my kingdom. So Peter's ministry was really explained by his name change. I would absolutely agree with the premise if God had actually changed Saul's name. Saul's supernatural meeting with Jesus on the road to Damascus occurred in Acts chapter 9, where Jesus clearly calls him Saul. He refers to him later as Saul of Tarsus, and even later in that chapter, Ananias calls him Brother Saul. He's actually not called Paul for the first time until chapter 13, verse 9. And the only line is Saul, who is also called Paul. So who changed his name? The writer of Acts. Why? Because Shaul was a Hebrew name and Paulos was a Roman name. His primary focus was going to be the Roman green, so he stuck with Paulos. So what does this have to do with Saul's conversion? Well, upon further review, there actually was no conversion, unless you want to call it a conversion from a murderer to a missionary, and I just prefer to call it Saul's redirection. So thank you for joining us for this week's Upon Further Review. Make sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and while you're there, check out all the other studies that are available. I'll see you next time. Until then, shalom, shalom.